Hi everyone, my name is Brittany, and thank you for joining me on Capella Group's Industry Insights podcast. Today, joining me is a very, very special guest. We have Jerry Anderson. He is the president of Federal Consulting Group, and just a few key points that I really wanted to point out to you guys is prior to Federal Consulting Group, Jerry was Associate Deputy Assistant to the Secretary of the Office of Affordable Housing Preservation. Not only that, but throughout his career, Jerry has been heavily involved with HUD-related transactions. On top of that, he is one of the few high-level executives at the OAHP that developed the Green Initiative and Green Retrofit Program. And furthermore, he also served as chairman of HUD's National Loan Committee and several other internal committees for loan and process approval. So, with all of that, Jerry, I just kind of want to jump into it a little bit and start off by asking, what is it that you are focusing heavily on right now? What is it that you do currently?
Well, through Federal Consulting Group, we really do a lot of transactions for HUD-related properties. We don't necessarily work for HUD, but we work for all the other entities that report to HUD, the public housing authorities, public housing commissions are in need of advice, and sometimes we have to do some conversions for those, which we can get into a little later.
Sure.
But I also do a lot of work for HUD-related issues with the private sector, where they may be selling a HUD property that has a Section 8 contract on it. And there's always an assumption, subordination, or the transfer of that contract that has to be implemented. And so we do a lot of financial reporting to HUD to get all of that accomplished. And so it's just a myriad of things, but it's mostly HUD related. It's housing and urban development related. And having been there for 7 years in Washington, it's still fun and enjoyable for me. So that's kind of our mantra as far as what we do as a business.
I know you're running all over the place. You do a lot. Okay. Well, with that, I kind of just want to jump in and ask you, what makes housing affordable and how are properties categorized?
The term affordable really stems from the tenants that plan to occupy the property.
Right.
And so affordable means we need housing that's affordable for the low income, extremely low income, very low income individuals. Those are weighted by doing a comparison with the area median income.
Okay.
So if we have the poverty level to 30% of area median income, those are the people that are extremely low income. They cannot afford rents, and those are the people that normally go into subsidized properties, such as Section 8, where HUD gives a subsidy. Those individuals only pay 30% of their income, and in a lot of cases that income is zero.
Right.
So they really don't even pay, and HUD pays for that part of it. Then there's another category, which is the very low income, which is 30 to 50%. And again, you know, they struggle to find housing. A lot of those are in the Section 8 as well, but there's only a limited number of Section 8 properties in the country, so that becomes problematic. And then we have the 80% of AMI, area median income and below. Those people generally you'll find in tax credit properties, low-income housing tax credit properties, where the rents are restricted, they're maintained, they are below market, but they're not subsidized, but they at least make it affordable for those people who aren't making a lot of money, basically. And so that affordable comes from those people that occupy the property. So we have Section 8. We have properties that are under low-income housing tax credits, and those are the two major areas where we'll find affordability, and that can meet the needs of those individuals.
And are you seeing that, I mean, you say it's across the board, are you seeing that weigh out differently in different states and regions? Or is it?
Well, it does because of population. And then
Makes sense.
the Rust Belt, which is, your Michigans, Ohios, Indianas, they're the ones that really did a lot of the Section 8 when Section 8 was available.
Gotcha.
They had the need because they had the majority of the population. Colorado has a need, but we don't have the population like a New York or a
Right.
Boston or a Philadelphia or some of the other areas of the country that really, that's where the affordability factor comes into play.
Wow. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Now, I think most of our viewers already know, what affordable housing is. But what about the supply of affordable housing versus the demand? Is there enough supply out there right now to meet the demand?
The answer is really a quick no. The problem is there's no longer a subsidized program from HUD. So Section 8, where we would subsidize those people with 30% of their income would be used for rents, and then HUD would subsidize. Those are no longer available, except on a program that we're currently working on, which is the rental assistance demonstration, and I'll get into that in a moment. So the only other factor really for affordability would be low-income housing tax credits.
Gotcha.
Those are constrained because each state is given so much of an allocation each year based on their population.
Really? Okay.
So, and it's never enough.
Right.
And so people are using up those low-income housing tax credits. But I'll be quite honest with you, the majority of our tenants or the residents that need the help are in that 50% of AMI and below. And so those tax credit rents are still very hard for them to maintain. So right now across the country, depending on who you talk to,
Sure.
there's between 7.2 and 12 million units needed today
Wow.
of affordable housing to meet the needs of those people who would qualify under those guidelines that I just laid out for you.
Wow.
So it's dramatic. And on top of that, we're losing affordable housing. And so one would say, well, how do you lose affordable housing?
Right.
Well, under the public housing program, which is a subsidized program again, and there the tenants pay 30% of their rent. But Congress gives us a budget every year through HUD for the public housing sector.
Gotcha.
I'm going to be blunt. Congress does not like the public housing. They think that the government owns that housing and that they're subsidizing it. So the public housing agencies and commissions will get an operating subsidy every year. They put in a budget. They're lucky if they get 85% of the budget.
Yeah.
That's to pay the bills.
Right.
And then on top of that, they always have capital needs. They need a new roof. They
Right.
need a
Good
new
stuff on it.
HVA system. They need new windows. HUD gives them a grant based on that, but it's never enough. And I have to say that the public housing agencies and commissions across the country have done a remarkable job band-aiding
Okay.
these properties from a rehab standpoint, but they haven't been able to keep up. So in public housing, we're losing 10 to 15,000 units a year because it becomes physically obsolescent and not livable for our tenants. It has to be safe, decent housing,
Yeah.
and when it turns to not safe, decent housing,
Right.
it has to be boarded up. And that's the housing we're losing.
Wow. And how does that differ? I mean, I don't know, a few years back, decade back. I mean, how is
It's
how has it
just been a continuum, and it's been unfortunately just getting worse because the capital grants that these commissions and agencies get on an annual basis has never really grown. It pretty much stays the same. And that's the reason that I mentioned the rental assistance demonstration program.
Right.
When I was at HUD, Secretary Sean Donovan said, we have a problem here, and he was absolutely correct.
Right.
And so he selected 4 of us to be on the senior management team to develop a program to take the public housing
Right.
and convert it over to Section 8. Under public housing, they're not allowed to borrow money. So if they have a roof or a need for a roof,
Right.
they can't go to the bank or go to HUD and do an FHA loan or anything. They're not allowed to borrow.
Wow, I did not know that. Wow.
Why? It's just the way the program was set up initially. And so all of a sudden you can see where the physical obsolescence of these properties comes into play.
Right.
And the RAD program, the Rental Assistance Demonstration, allows us to take that public housing and convert it over to the Section 8 platform,
Okay.
which then they're allowed to borrow money. We can do tax credits. They can go to the private sector. We're no longer dependent on Congress for a capital grant that has always been insufficient anyway.
I could agree with that part of it.
So from that standpoint, you can see that it's just been a continuum that has been getting worse, but now we're converting those public housing units, there was about 1.5 million units,
Wow.
and we've already converted 750,000 to the new platform.
And so you think there's going to be less and less public housing and more of like the Section 8 and whatnot?
Yes.
Or okay.
Yeah, that's really, I think, it's always been, when I was at HUD, that was in the back of our minds that we needed to convert that whole portfolio. There's still some resistance because people don't like change.
Sure.
And some of them, quite honestly, some of the public housing agencies are doing well.
Right.
You know, they get enough of a subsidy on an annual basis and enough of a grant that they can operate fine. And so they're not interested in going through this whole process. And within HUD, there's 2 silos, I call them. One is public housing, one is housing.
Okay.
The public housing is where they get the subsidy from Congress, and the housing, which was where I worked, is where the Section 8 resides and sits. So they would be converting from that public housing
Right.
over to housing, and it would be a different set of people within HUD that they'd be reporting to. So there's some resistance there, and I understand that. It makes perfect sense.
Right. Wow. That's a lot to take in, but it's good. No, I appreciate you kind of explaining that and kind of breaking it down so not only our viewers could understand, but so I could understand too. Because it's a big industry, and it's, from my understanding, it's really just giving back to the people, and it's really helping the people because that's what we need.
Yeah.
So kind of moving on from there, I want to talk a little bit about when it comes to affordable housing. I know it's not, one and done, right? And so it needs to be maintained. What does that process of maintaining look like?
Again, there's these 2 silos that we're dealing with, and those are the major areas of public housing or of affordable housing. The low-income housing tax credit program does a good job of doing a capital needs assessment right up front,
Okay, good.
knowing the needs of the property. Most of them are either rehab, substantial rehab, or built new.
Okay.
So if they're built new, obviously we're setting in pretty good shape
Yep.
from the rehab standpoint. When you get into a lot of the properties I deal with are older Section 8, and so we can combine that Section 8 with the low-income housing tax credits. We do the capital needs assessment, and we reassess what we call the replacement reserve
Okay.
for each of the properties. And that really, we take a look at the 20-year needs of the property from the capital needs standpoint, not painting a unit or anything like that.
Right.
But actually doing the capital needs, the HVAC, the roof, tuck pointing if it's brick.
Yep.
All of those things come into play. Kitchen cabinets, bathrooms, those are major components that we have to deal with. So if we combine the Section 8 with low-income housing tax credits, we again do the reassessment. We do a lot of the fix-up up front, and then we set up the annual deposit to the replacement reserve to be adequate to cover those capital needs for that 20-year period.
Wow.
Now, I will tell you there's been a hiccup.
Okay.
And anyone in construction out there understands this.
Yeah.
Having gone through COVID and all the restrictions that we've seen on supplies, it has really peaked then the cost of the supplies and the cost of materials.
Yep.
And I'm sure I'm not telling anyone anything.
Right. It's been crazy.
But that has created somewhat of a problem for us, but we see that softening a little bit now, and as the supplies get greater and come into play, we're seeing more realistic pricing coming in, but it was a real struggle during COVID too.
Did things kind of stand still when that was at the peak of it, or were you guys just improvising or pivoting? Or?
We were still improvising and having to redo budgets and reforecast and do things like that. A few projects we just kind of put on hold.
Sure.
And because there wasn't an emergency need to get them done, but I'll tell you, there were some that we were already in the process. And to stop at that point would have just been a disaster.
Yeah.
And so we had to just kind of bite the bullet, do the best we could,
Right.
stretch it out, buy as many of the supplies as we could up front.
Mm-hmm.
Getting the supplies was the other issue. If you could buy them, getting them then was the next issue.
Oh yeah, the delays and everything.
Yep. And then we've had issues with personnel and having enough contractors on site and enough framers and people to work on these properties
Or people that are qualified.
that qualified. And most of them obviously were concerned over COVID and everything. Totally understandable. But it was a real cycle that we've had to go through. But I think we're on the downside of that now.
Sure.
And so we're seeing a lot more activity.
It's like you can't stay like that forever, and that's
No.
what we kept saying. I mean, in our construction industry as a GC company, I mean, we know that we had to pivot too.
Yeah.
But you have to find solutions. You have to, be optimistic.
Yep.
Try to find that, right? So, okay. Now, when it comes to looking to the future, and how do we go about solving the long-term affordable housing crisis?
Well, there's a couple of things. Number one, the RAD program, the rental helps, at least another $1.5 million, which is substantial.
It is.
And it hopefully stops that bleeding of the 15 to 20,000 units a year loss. We really need to cut that off. It's terrible that we don't have enough, let alone losing that many on an annual basis.
Right.
But there's a lot of activity in Congress right now with a lot of groups that are trying to increase the tax credit allocation so that we can have the states with more of an allocation, that they can do more towards the affordable housing concerns for the country. That's really a big one. And I know a few of the gentlemen in Washington that are working on this, and they're really doing a remarkable job. And we just keep looking every year at the budgets.
Right.
And seeing if we can't get those budgets increased from the allocation standpoint for the states. As well as the bond, the private activity bonds, because on 4% credits you have to use private activity bonds. Okay. There's a bond cap that stops those.
Okay.
So we try and get that cap increased at the same time. So this is some of the process that we're getting into. I need to mention too that the low income also affects our elderly. Because if our elderly are on Social Security only, they probably fall in that 50% of AMI or less. And so we have a lot of elderly that we're dealing with as well, and a lot of low-income housing tax credit properties now are being built for elderly.
Wow.
Or at least having a segment of that property designated for elderly, which is kind of nice.
And is that newer on that side of things?
It's newer from the standpoint that I'm seeing a lot more developers that are being more conscientious towards that elderly group that's out there. And the fact that they're getting Social Security, that's a pretty good source of income, to be quite honest with you. And it's fairly sustainable rather than somebody that's unemployed or moving from job to job. And so we're seeing a lot of that happening as well. HUD has again put a couple of programs into place for their elderly programs. They have what we call the 202 program, which is a program with a subsidy
Okay.
for elderly. And under this RAD program, we're doing what we call RAD for PRAC,
Okay.
which is a RAD conversion again for elderly.
Okay.
We're still working through that one. There's
Yeah.
some rough spots on that one, and
Okay.
trying to get it tied to low-income housing tax credits. And the investors for the tax credits are saying we need the HAP contract in place, and HUD's going, we need to know what you're doing there.
Yeah.
So we have this
Back and
kind of a dilemma that we're in,
Right.
but we're working through it. We're getting there with it. My company has a few of those that we're working on, and we work very closely with HUD
Right.
in trying to get that done, and they're very willing to work with us on making changes where they may see that coming into play.
Wow.
So
That's good to know too. Like I said, I wasn't aware of that either. But it's good. Again, you guys are hammering it from every angle. And I guess my last question is, you have years and years of wisdom, of knowledge, things that you've been, your fingerprints everywhere. You've really been making an impact. And what got you into this industry to begin with? Why did you choose to go down this road?
I was kind of thrown into it, to be honest with you. I come from a financial background where I worked at a savings and loan,
Okay.
and then we had the savings and loan debacle, and the Resolution Trust Corporation came into play. I was fortunate to work for a savings loan that was not in a category of the bad guys.
Right.
And although we were taken over by the FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, we worked through it. They kept me on to sell the savings loan that I worked for. And then after we completed that transaction, they said, come and work for us at the Resolution Trust. Well, at the Resolution Trust, we were taking back a lot of these properties, a lot of properties that could be used for affordable housing.
Right.
So we formed an affordable housing group. I wasn't part of the group, but I worked with that group when I was at the RTC, the Resolution Trust Corporation, so that we could take some of the garden level apartments and so on and convert those and make them affordable, and make them affordable for affordable residents.
Right.
And there was some success there. And so when we dissolved the RTC, I went to work for a consulting firm, and we were tapped by HUD to come and look at a new program that was taking expiring Section 8 contracts and marking them to market, which meant lowering the rents.
Right. Wow.
And the problem there was you lower the rents on those properties and the owner's going to hand you the keys.
Makes sense.
Because it's just like I lost my job, but I still have a house payment. And so we put into play restructuring the debt on those properties. We would figure out what the market rent or what the rents could be in that area. And then we restructured debt that would satisfy that still gave the owner cash flow, because a lot of these properties were owned by private sector owners.
Right.
And then we could put a soft second on it for that difference between the old mortgage and the new mortgage to be
Okay.
paid off with a portion of the cash flow over years.
Wow.
And so I got involved with it right there because I helped develop that program, but I helped develop it then as a consultant. And then we got involved in doing those restructures as well.
Wow.
So after that, I had military, I'd had the RTC. I said, I only need 3 more years of government to retire. And so I started looking, and then Washington found out I was looking and said, why don't you come to Washington and work with us in the Office of Affordable Housing Preservation,
Wow.
which is the office that I was doing the consulting for anyway. It was a natural for me. I knew all the people there. I actually liked all the people there.
That's huge.
And it was a very innovative group that the secretary said, you guys go figure out how to take care of these things and make presentations.
Wow.
And we did, and it was fun. And
Right.
I stayed 7 years rather than 3. So
Wow.
that's how I got into affordable housing.
I appreciate it. Because I knew there had to be more to the story.
Yep.
I can't begin to thank you for even taking the time today to come on to our podcast, share with our viewers, because again, the knowledge, the wisdom you have, I think it's going to help a lot of people understand this market and kind of where we see it going, some solutions and everything. And so thank you for your time.
Well, thank you, and I hope it's beneficial to at least
Absolutely.
keep the affordable housing needs out in front of people, because sometimes I think it wanes by the wayside, and we'd like to keep that rolling.
Bring it back up to the front.
So thank you as well.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
it.